Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 6. Will be presentation about analysis of story tales The Birds Who Befriended a King. And our member are me, Nadila Sasabilla, and then Nadila Putri and Syafa Nur, and the last Syauqi Fawas Muyasar. The first analysis about setting. Setting time. This is how the Hopo came to know the great King Solomon, and quote or supporting text in the story is about this how the Hopos came to know the great King Solomon once he was foraged in the wilderness, for there was no part of his kingdom that Solomon did not visit. He had seen that the great store city was finished to his liking, even that more in the desert and across the sand the king cavalcade made its way, with the camels and the dromedaries and the broidered saddle-cloth bright as flower, and jeweled bright loose blazing as brightly as the sun itself. And the next places have two, wilderness and palace. And then wilderness, in opening of the story of when King Solomon on the way. Quote of supporting text in the story are, once he was foraged in the wilderness, for there was no part of his kingdom that Solomon did not visit. And then one day, however, when they were right out in the wilderness and the sun was beating down with all its mighty ray of sunlight, flashes through and struck and the king face. And then palace, in opening and when hobos coming. Quote or supporting text in the story are, when they reached his palace, he thanked them for the service they had done him and asked what he could to it returned. And they came to visit wonderful palace and saw all the servants in their shining robes standing behind the king's throne and waiting at his table and lining the great courtyard. And when they beheld the walls of ivory inlaid with gold, and the golden lion guarding the steps, and the white peacocks, and the silver terraces. And then, setting social condition, have happy, sad, and disappointment. Happy, when the Hopos get the crown they wore for their first plan to become the leader of the bird-clad. Quote or supporting text in the story is, off flew the silly little bird. They wore with the sign crowns upon their heads, rather than the peacocks, and cattering more loudly than the parrots and macaws. They could scarcely wait to get back to their friends and heard their exclamation, and said, when other birds are being hunted by money. Quote or supporting text in the story is, then came the saddest time for the Hopos. Everyone began to hate them, and the poor little bird could not go to the wells and the pools, for they were thick with nets. They could not go into the garden for flower liquor behind the flower. They could not fly up onto the hearth's top, for even there the people had trap for them. And the last, disappointment, when the crown is useless. Quote or supporting text in the story, "Ah, king," said they, "we have found a gold crown of vanity. We know not what you do to keep yourself from being cast about and hunted, and so we have come to ask you to remove our from us." And next analysis will be delivered by our member.
Thank you for your time. I want to explain the next material about characters and characterization. The first, King Solomon are polite, firm, and full of wise words. Quote or supporting text in the story. The first, the little bird cast a grateful shadow over the king for his whole journey, and wisely replied they were. For Solomon, always polite in the humblest creature in his kingdom, conversed freely with them during the whole time. And the second, all the same, return to me without fear or shame, if your crown don't satisfy, said King Solomon kindly, and ordered his goldsmith to supply the hopes with crown of the finest gold pursuable. And the third, beloved hopes, said the king. A crown that people are expected to bow down to, always sit heavy on the head, and a crown that excites envy is a net for the feet, the only crown that can be worn with comfort is the crown of service, and the crown should spring up naturally so that no one takes any particular notice of it. And third, and how did you come to visit her? Said Solomon, very strangely. Were you not on duty, and now you not the penalty for those who fly from duty? And last, because no less than the king himself had said, he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise, returned the hopeless. Second, hopeless always curious to know something and too bold with something. Quote or supporting text in the story. The first, being curious by nature, they circled round until they reached the king's camel and kept just overhead, so that they might watch this most famous of all monarchs and present over here some word of wisdom. Thus the little bird cast a grateful shadow over the king for his whole journey, and wisely replied they were, for Solomon always polite to the humblest creature in his kingdom, consorted freely with them during the whole time. The second, finally, they decide they would like golden crowns such as the king himself wore. Then they could return to the other birds and recline over them. Thereupon the little bird flew down with a rush and made their request to the king as he walked in his wonderful garden. And the third, the eagle was so surprised at the hope's boldness that he allowed it to accompany him back to the flying carpet, and the hopes flew onto the arm of Solomon's throne. And last, and now, what is your answer, O Solomon? Am, am I to return and tell her she may come and learn of your wisdom, or will you crush a little bird in your hand, whose only fault is that it is so curious, a fault by the by, which led me to fly over your head the first time we meet one another. And the third is Queen Balkis, beautiful queen but weak and sad. Quote or supporting text in the story. The first, yeah, I was reached the place. I kissed the wonder tree. So seated on the throne of ebony was the most beautiful queen it is possible to imagine, with golden hair rippling over the steps of the throne and fed by dozens of servants into a whirling golden cold. And the second, go to your master and ask if his wisdom has taught him kindness, and if he will design to advise a weak and sorrowful queen who has scarcely the courage to cross the desert and present herself before the throne of one who has ruled him kingdom so well. And the next material will be delivered by Syafa Nur. The time is yours.
Okay, I will continue this. The material is point of view and themes. Point of view in the story, the birds who befriended a king tells about a third-person point of view, where in the story the author tells the story using he, she, and it. And the theme in the story, the moral or theme of the story, when we are kind to other people will be kind to us. If we help other people, then we will also be helped. So whatever good we do for ourselves or others, it will be useful for us later. And fourth, problem and conflict. Quotes in the story is, very soon people began to notice the queer antics of the silly little things as they started up and down, cooking their heads first this side, then that, and finally a man caught one and discovered the wonderful golden crown it wore. He hurried off with it to a goldsmith who gave him so high a price for it that the men rushed back to the pool and laid snares for the hoops, who were so taken up with admiring themselves that they walked straight into them. And then came the saddest time for the hoopos. Everyone began to hunt them. The poor little birds couldn't go to the wells and the pools, for they were thick with gnats. They could not to go into the gardens, for flowers lurked behind the wallflowers. They could not fly up into the housetops, for even there the people had set traps for them. There did not seem a spot on the earth where they could rest. And last, the watch little birds flew back to the palace and waited until they beheld the great King Solomon coming along his terrace, listening to his teenagers as they performed in the cool of the evening. And then the types of conflict and the 5 stages of plot. Types of conflict in the story is man versus animal. And the 5 stages of the plot, there are 2 conflicts in the story. First, exposition. Quotes in the story is, this is how the hoopos came to know the great King Solomon. Once he was far out in the wilderness, for there was not part of the kingdom that Solomon did not visit. He had seen that the great store city was finished to his liking. Even Tadmor in the desert, and across the sand the king's cavalcade made its way, with the camels and the dromedaries and their broader saddle clothes bright as flower, and jeweled bridle flashing as brightly as the sun itself. But the head smote down on the king's head, and Solomon yearned for said, as if in answer to his longing, who should appear but a flock of hoopos. Being curious by nature, they circled round until they reached the king's camel and kept just overhead, so that they might watch this most famous of all monarchs and perchance overhear some word of wisdom. Thus the little birds cast a grateful shadow over the king for his whole journey, and richly repaid they were, for Solomon always polite to the humbled creator in his kingdom, conversed freely with them during the whole time. And one day, however, when they were right out in the wilderness and the sun was beating down with all its might, a ray of sunlight flashed through and struck the king's face. A whole head appeared in the canopy. And the rising action of this story is, so instead of answering Solomon with thanks on their part on telling him his words of wisdom were reward for any shelter they had given, the hoopos begged leave to consult together and withdrew to the palace roof, where they discussed what they would ask for. Finally, they decided they would like golden crowns such as the king himself wore. Then they could return to the other birds and reign over them. Thereupon the little birds flew down with a rush and made their request to the king as he walked in his wonderful garden. What the king had said, Solomon replied, the gift you desire shall be granted yet, because you rendered me true service. When you wish to get rid of your crowns, you may return and exchange them for wisdom. Nay, king, said the hoopos. Well, we know that wisdom has brought you great renown, but no one would bow down to your or give attention to your words. Unless you wear your golden crown, we shall be able to repeat your wise words profitably now, for all will listen when they see gold crowns on our heads too. And then naturally word was passed to the eagle, who flew up at once to see what had happened, and thus perceived one of the hoopus was absent from its place, leaving a hole through which the sunburn entered. The eagle presented itself before Solomon, therefore, and told the amazing news. And Solomon ordered the eagle to hasten off the once and find the missing hoopus, who must have scared up and above the heads of all the other birds to make it escape. For no one had seen it go off when the eagle rising up and until it was lost to sight in the high skies, but do no one on earth could see the eagle now. His sight was very keen, and presently he beheld a speck winging its way across the distant desert and swooping down, met the missing hoopus. Where have you been?" cried the eagle. That's all from me. The next material will be delivered by Syauqi Fawas. Thank you.
Okay, I will continue the presentation about types of conflict and the 5 stages of plot. The types of conflict is a man versus animal. Then the 5 stages of plot. There are 2 conflicts in this story. Exposition. The first conflict. This is how the hoopus come to know the great King Solomon. Once he was far out in the wilderness, for there was no part of his kingdom that Solomon did not visit. He had seen that the great store city was finished to his liking, even Tadmor in the desert and across the sand. The king's cavalcade made its way, with the camels and the dromedaries and their broidered saddle clothes bright as a flowers, and jeweled bridles flashing as brightly as the sun itself. But the heat smote down on the king's head, and Solomon yearned for it, as if in answer to his longing. Who should appear but a flock of hoopus, being curious by nature? They circled round until they reached the king's camels and kept just overhead, so that they might watch this most famous of all monarchs and perchance overhear some words of wisdom. Thus the little bird cast a grateful shadow over the king for his whole journey, and richly repaid they were. For Solomon always polite to humble creature in his kingdom, conversed freely with them during the whole time. And then the second exposition in a 2 conflict. One day, however, when they were right out in the wilderness, and the sun was beating down with all its might, a ray of sunlight flashed through and struck the king's face. A hole had appeared in the canopy. Okay, next rising action. In the first conflict, so instead of answering Solomon with thanks on their part and telling him his word of wisdom, were rich rewards from any shelter they had given, the hoopus picked left to consult together and withdrew to the place roof where they discussed what they would ask for. Finally, they decided they would like golden crowns such as the kingdom himself wore. Then they called their turn to the other birds and reigned over them. Thereupon the little bird flew down with a rush and made their request to the king as he walked in his wonderful garden. What the king has said? The king has said, Solomon replied, the gift you desire shall be granted yet, because you rendered me true service. When you wish to get rid of your crowns, you may return and exchange them for wisdom. Nay, king, said the hopeless. Well, we know that wisdom has brought you great renown, but no one will bow down to you or give attention to your words, unless you wear your golden crown. We shall be able to repeat your wise words profitably. Now, for all will listen when they see gold crown on our heads too. And then the second, naturally, word has passed to the eagle, who flew up at once to see what had happened, and thus perceived one of the hoppers was absent from its place, leaving a hole through which the sunbeam entered. The eagle presented itself before Solomon therefore, and told the amazing news. And Solomon ordered the eagle to hasten off at once and find the missing hoppers, who must have soared up and above the heads of all the other birds to make its escape, for no one had seen it go. Off went the eagle, reaching up and up until it was lost to sight in the high skies. But though no one on earth could see the eagle now, his sight was very keen, and presently he beheld a speech winging its way across the distant desert and swooping down. Meet the missing hoppers. Where have you been? Cried the eagle. Okay, next, climax. Climax in a first conflict. Off flew the silly little bird. Therefore, with the shining crown upon their heads, broader than the peacock and chattering more loudly than the parrots and macaws. They could scarcely wait to get back to their friends and hear their exclamation. But when the hoppers informed their friends there were no kings of the bird world, their friends only laughed and said they were quite satisfied with Solomon, and he was the only king they wished or needed. Then they drove the hoppers from the trees for their golden crown, were always catching in the branches, and the other birds became tired and helping them out. But the hoppers decided the other birds were jealous and rather flattered, gathered round the pools so that they could admire themselves in the water. Very soon, people began to notice the queer, antics of the silly little thing as they strutted up and down, cocking their heads first this side, then that, and finally a man caught one and discovered the wonderful golden crown in it wore. He hurried off with it to a goldsmith, who gave him so high a price for it that the man rushed back to the pool and laid share for the hobos, who were so taken up with admiring themselves that they walked straight into them. Then came the saddest time for the hobos. Everyone began to hunt them. The poor little bird could not to go to the wells and the poor, for they were thick with need. They could not go into the garden, for fowlers lurked behind the flowers. They could not fly up onto the housetop, for even the people had set trap for them. There did not seem a spot on the earth where they could rest, and at last they reached. Little bird flew back to the place and waited till they beheld the great King Solomon coming along his terrace, listening to his singer as they performed in the cool of the evening. Okay, next. The first climax in the second conflict. The hobos was so excited it broke into verse because it could not express its feelings any other way. But the eagle was terribly angry. The hobos did not seem to mind having deserted Solomon. There it soared and circled, making up poetry about a queen as if it had done nothing wrong at all. And in the meantime, what do you think the great and wise kingdom has been doing? Thundered the eagle. Whose noble head you are supposed to seal? Ah, spare time, I beg, said the little hobos, for the sake of no other than our wise and noble king. Spare you for his sake, said the eagle, very surprised. What mercy do you deserve, and how can spare you help our great kings? Nevertheless, I say, spare me for his sake, repeated the hobos, and take me back with you as quickly as you please, for I have a most urgent message to deliver to no other than Solomon himself. Okay, next, feeling action. In the first conflict, O king, said they, we have found the golden crown our vanity. We know not what you do to keep yourself from being cast about and hunted, and so we have come to ask you to remove our from us. And then the second conflict. I, and the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, said Solomon sternly. Ah, great king, curse me, not till I have given the message, cried the hobo. Until you have heard the whole of the story, you cannot judge. Hearken to the story of my visit. Fertile and abundant in species and calms is the land of Sheba. But I could notice little for wonder at the marble place all jet black with rose with the center of kingdom. Yet as I reached the place, I gazed to wonder through it, for the seated on the throne of ebony was the most beautiful queen it is possible to imagine. With golden hair rippling over the step of the throne and fanned by dozens of saffron into a whirling golden cloud. I asked why they were fanning her, and they said because the queen's crown sat so heavy on her so could not bear the weight of her own hair. I flew and among the perfumed streets, fine as golden rain, and thus I came close to her, and I heard her whispering to herself that she lacked wisdom, understanding, and knew not how to govern her kingdom. Next, and the last resolution in the first conflict. May it shelter you even as it sheltered me, said the great king, and on their heads the hobos, behind crown of feather, but with the crowns come quite a new feeling to the hobos. The longer wished to rule but to serve. Now the Arabian legend has it, Solomon had a wonderful flying carpet where he sat on the golden throne with all his attendants round him. Mindful of the hobos' usefulness, he summoned all the birds to make flying canopy. The eagle was placed at their height, but the hobos were placed immediately over Solomon as he sat in the center of his court. His shadow, Solomon and his friend and servant would rise from the ground and travel across the desert and over sea and land in cool and comfort. And then the second conflict. Fly back to the queen with these signet rings and tell her where a little bird does not fear to come. A queen may safely follow. If a hobo can learn wisdom and put it to such profit, shall not a queen? Then the hobo joyfully rose up from the head of Solomon and flew back Queen Balkis. And when the wonderful procession safely reached Solomon's place, and the great Queen Balkis and the long train of camels laden with spices and precious stones and gold and ebony and ivory knelt before his throne. The little hobo circled in the air above their head, singing in its glad shrill voice this word the king so often uttered. A word fitly spoken is like apples of the gold in pictures of silver, as an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold. So is a wise reprover upon an obedient earth. Okay, that's all for our presentation. Thanks for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.